you should feel uncomfortable in your job about 30% of the time. It's a good rule of thumb, because if you're comfortable 100% of the time, you're probably sticking to the stuff you know and you're missing a whole load of other stuff. Every career move is a trade. You're trading what you have specialized in before with what you don't know, and you give them the specialism and then you take the learning.
This thought that architecture follows money, where did it originate from? Where's the seed planted?
It's not about individuals doing stupid stuff or being stupid necessarily. It's the system. I want people to be motivated to try and change things, but I want them to understand that it might be that the system is rigged against them, and not to punish themselves too hard for that.
Today, I'm joined by Miell, CTO over at Container Solutions, and we talk about how you can level up as senior software engineer. We cover systems thinking and what that means, and we talk about how your software architecture actually follows the money. So enjoy. I do these Q&As where people send questions, and one of the questions I got recently was, how do I pitch to either senior leadership, technical or non-technical, and how do I get their buy-in? And there's a lot that goes into that, which I think is interesting, because we as technical people, we are in positions where we can influence certain decisions. And through doing this podcast, through being involved in conferences, I feel like there's a lot of skills that you don't really pick up on, which is quite interesting. Like knowing your audience, for example. If you're pitching to senior leadership, if you're really technical in your conversation, you're going to lose people in essence. If you're talking to the CMO versus the CFO, you might hook them with different ways of communicating, but also in the content that you actually share, what makes them tick and what could actually have them have buy-in. You can leverage that if you really know your audience. That's separate from the skills to actually communicate that.
I think as you're talking, the thing that I'm thinking of most is because I've done more presenting than most.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's because of that, but I've found that I'm much more able to call out whatever is in the room at the time. So if I'm presenting to someone senior and it looks like they're bored, I'll just say, I feel like I'm losing you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it works because that gives them the space to actually say, yeah, actually you have lost me. I didn't understand this. You go, okay, let's go back to that. And you might be able to get them back that way. But you can only do that if you're really confident in your ability. But in the same way, like I think a lot of people just want to get through that meeting and get out the other side,
race through it
without being humiliated. And once you're a certain level of confidence, you can call out those things and make them explicit. I'm doing that. I'm working with a client, a customer, in a sort of, it's kind of a cultural change program, but it's focused on a specific technical area. And I'm finding myself a lot of the time saying, I feel like you don't want to do this. I feel like, and just saying that, you can see the relief when you say that, because then they can say, yeah, actually I do feel that because of this. And then you can go, okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
That's kind of fun.
That's really strong. Yeah. It's one of those skills that I feel like if you're talking about seniority, at some point you're going to be comfortable within your technical domain to a point where it's so comfortable that you might not want to try anything else. But that's besides the thing. I do feel like if you go from a senior position either to a leadership track or definitely to a C-level, even if we're talking about a CTO as a label, you will need to be well equipped to have conversations like that in front of an audience, but also one-on-one, to make sure you actually find what makes people tick and what makes people either object or how you get the buy-in you need.
Yeah, and I think that point about getting outside your comfort zone and outside the domain that has made you successful in your career is an important one. I like to say to people, you should feel uncomfortable in your job about 30% of the time. It's a good rule of thumb, because if you're comfortable 100% of the time, you're probably sticking to the stuff you know and you're missing a whole load of other stuff.
Yeah, you're coasting.
Yeah. And you should be exploring those areas that make you feel a little bit unsure of yourself. One of the best things I ever did was I worked for a company for 14 years, and I knew that domain like really well, as well as almost anyone. And then I went into a completely different domain. I mean, not completely different. It wasn't like going to, doing sociology somewhere on the other side of the world, but it was a completely different kind of company, different scale, everything. And, I was completely lost for a while. I just didn't, I remember the guy who hired me, asking him questions, and could see the expression on his face was like, oh, he really doesn't get what he's into yet. He's just thinking about this the wrong way. And he was very kind. He didn't slam me. He just kind of showed me what I was missing.
Okay.
And once I got through that stage, I realized what I was in and learned a lot from that process. So yeah, I think being uncomfortable is something you should check on regularly.
I think it's really cool that we can leverage a very technical, a very hard skill, and we can still be effective in a lot of domains. So then the fresh part could be, I'm going from something that's very retail, very consumer facing, to something that's completely financial and operating towards businesses, which domain wise, there might be overlap, but in the most cases, there's not much overlap. And then what you bring is like your hard skills to the table, and you can familiarize yourself, if you like that, curiosity wise as well. I think a lot of domains are interesting. You can do that.
Yeah, and it gives you more options in your career. So the more, every career move is a trade. You're trading what you have specialized in before with what you don't know, and you give them the specialism, and then you take the learning. And if you keep doing that, you'll end up with a whole load of arrows in your quiver that you can then use later in your career. So yeah, I really, unless you're like a hyper specialist, and those people are very rare. They exist, but they're very rare. I recommend for the vast majority of people, just go get new experiences. Yeah,
I could see how you can leverage those experiences, and it makes you a more well-rounded individual. I'm very curious from your perspective, with either seniors you've worked with or from your own experience, when people reach a certain level of seniority, some people kind of get stuck with regards to growth, and they experiment a lot, but they might fall back on that comfort zone that is more the hard skill side of things. What is your advice for people to actually break through and go beyond a certain level of seniority?
From my experience, and I've mentioned it already, just change your environment completely. Because another aspect is not just that you are more comfortable, but everyone else is more comfortable with you being in that role. I noticed that when I moved from that, I was in that company for 14 years, and that company went from I was 39th to join. We went to 770 people. So it felt like I did many different jobs in that company. It felt like many different things, but I was Ian, and people had me in a box.
Yeah.
And when I moved to another company, I noticed people were listening to what I was saying for a time, for 6 months. People would actually listen to what I was saying in a way that they didn't before. And then I had a bunch of other challenges because of that. But it allowed me to break free of that comfort zone, that domain. And then once I'd done that once, it made it a lot easier to do it subsequently. But it is partly definitely that people will see you as that person. I know many people who are in certain jobs and they want to progress, but they're just seen as the techie, and they just get put in that box, and they're useful, and people just want to use them for that.
Yeah.
So.
One of my previous guests, Pasha, he used to work at Uber, and he said that's one of the reasons I left. He called the burden of context. Just due to being there historically, he was being dragged in sessions to explain the context, and people would also come to him for advice, but he wanted to focus on very different things than what he was actually focusing on. So then by default, through you being there, also probably being good at what you do, you get this burden of context, and people have expectations of you. You're known within the org, but it might not be what makes you happy.
Yeah, but it comes with great benefits, right? You're very secure.
Yeah.
Like, they won't fire you if you know a lot.
That's true.
And you're still motivated to work and not doing anything stupid. You will keep your job. And that's, for me, I had kids in the middle of that time. And my wife chose to stay at home. We chose for my wife to stay at home with the kids. And that meant that there was more pressure on me. I felt more pressure. And so I stayed a lot longer than maybe I would have done otherwise.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons was that feeling of security.
Exactly. Switching context is very powerful. I feel like I do it a lot in consultancies. For me, the downside is I have to build up the relationships and the people, like certain political credit, certain relationships, all from scratch again. Now to the point where I'm actually like, I don't know how long I would want to do that, because I feel like being in an org on the longer term also has its benefits.
I love that. I mean, I wrote a piece once on why I love consulting, and one of the reasons was you get to meet new people all the time, and I really enjoy that. and you start to see patterns, but nowhere is the same. It's like being a doctor, I guess. No two patients are the same, but you do start to see patterns of behavior and patterns of, thought and so on. And that's where the book came from, I guess.
Yeah. We talked about seniority and moving to beyond seniority, breaking through a ceiling in essence. Can you tell me more about that?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, I guess, about the adding context. I think it becomes easier as you get older because you've had a more varied experience. And I'm not just talking about career, but also, I'm CTO now of Container Solutions, which is a cloud native consultancy, and we help businesses with really challenging organizational and technical change problems all together, all in one. So we talk about strategy, but we also do the tech. I joined as an engineer. I wanted to get back to engineering. I had that kind of midlife crisis of like, what am I now as in my career? And I was like, I want to get back to engineering. That's when I was really happy. I guess I felt that urge to. I had a kind of, I suppose it was a bad experience, bad career experience, and I kind of want to get back to my comfort zone. But I found that as soon as I joined that company, I was asking about the balance sheet and what's the cash flow looking like, and where's the graph of revenue versus profit and so on. And everyone was like, no one else is asking these questions. You should think about going more commercial, being in the more commercial side. So I then moved into sales.
Okay.
So I was still with customers, but I was also heavily involved in the sales process. And I really enjoyed that because I got to meet, all these clients were coming to us talking about their challenges. And I enjoyed meeting them and I enjoyed talking to them. So I loved that work. I still do that, but it wasn't only what I did. But through doing that, I saw the commercial side more clearly, why people buy services like that, like the ones we had, and how those things get sold, and then how they get handed over to engineering. And I guess through that, I got to know the board, and then the board said, you've got to be a C if you want to sit on the board. So you're now CTO. And so I didn't set out to rise up the hierarchy, but I just found myself, because I was in this new situation and I'd seen other situations before, I wasn't just interested in the engineering. I still miss it. I still don't do enough of it as I'd like to. But I find that as I get older, and I guess this is another aspect of it, and I've had more experience. I've got 30 years in the field now. Actually, no, 25 years in the field now. I find that my value is far more in recognizing what works and having the confidence to say, no, this is the right person to hire. This is not the right person to hire. This engineer is going to work really well with that client and not with this client. Those kind of judgment calls are seen as more valuable than before. I mean, I was reflecting to my CEO the other day that a lot of my job is now simply coaching. It's calling out those meetings where no one seems to be talking. Why is no one talking? That kind of conversation is far more what I do now than technical. Now I have people. I've hired people I trust to make technical calls, and I might disagree with them, but I don't really ever overrule them because they have to live with the consequences of their decisions. If I think it's a really bad decision, I might do that. But generally they're not obviously bad decisions. They're more like, well, I prefer this, but sometimes I'm just too old. Like I haven't been in the field in the last 10 years, so maybe I'm slightly out of date. Had an argument with one engineer recently about ORMs, and he was in favor of using them in this particular context. And I'm like, I don't like them. But, maybe that's because I'm old enough to remember writing all my SQL by hand. And not wanting to let go of that. So, but I think also because if you have grey hair and you're a little bit older, people in positions of seniority and authority just trust your judgment more.
Yeah.
You tend to have, I guess with age, you tend to have more, you tend to make less impetuous decisions. You tend to reflect more on your decision making. So yeah, I think partly just getting older helps, but having that wider set of experiences can help too.
Yeah, I learned a lot, I think, when I moved away from software engineering to actually being hands-on responsible for product, because then I also got to touch a lot of other aspects with regards to, okay, how do we do marketing, or even how do we do more sales from that aspect specifically, or what certain decisions do we have to actually make, and how does that impact tech, and how do we balance then delivery versus quality, and do we need to cut some things when going to production, and can I actually communicate those trade-offs well to get buy-in from
You were
people?
a product manager, is that right?
Yeah.
So I think we used to call those project managers back in the day, but now we call them product managers. I mean, it fulfills the same position in the system. And yeah, you can't just think about the technical. You've got to think about your stakeholders and the roadmap, and do your key customers want this thing, and do you have to sacrifice that other thing for it? Those kind of decisions are really, really tough. I mean, my first job was not dissimilar. So my first proper job in IT was working for an online gambling company. So it was sports betting, back-end systems. And the structure of the business was that you had a tech lead on a particular customer. So it was a product, but we had about 6 big customers, and I was one of the tech leads for the big customer, and you were basically the project manager, I guess, or project leader, or however it was, and you had a project manager with you, who was I hope I'm not upsetting people, but I think they were slightly subordinate.
Okay.
So the techie was in charge, but the project manager was kind of probably the wiser old head who would help you probably navigate some of the things that as a young techie you were not so great at. I mean, that was kind of what happened. And also they were more organized.
Yeah.
And the customer would look to them for the more organizational side. They would look to you for the kind of, are you going to break production this week with this release or not kind of questions. So yeah, I learned a lot, I guess, about balancing those things, because I'd have engineers saying, but this is the right thing to do. And you'd say, no, this release can't fail. Like we're in trouble already for the last release. So I want a safe release this time. And they'd be like, yeah, but it's the wrong thing to do. And, I was not prepared I was not well prepared or mentored to be that role, but it did teach me a lot about being in that role. Yeah. For sure.
I think I learned a lot about, 2 aspects of things. One, what people are responsible for, that's exactly what they're going to look at. So if I'm having conversations with legal and compliance, they are there to mitigate risk or to kill it. The best is if there's no risk, because if we're in a bigger organization, for some aspects, especially tech, we don't need to afford risk. So we need to squash it or accommodate it in any shape or way. So if I did my homework, I can say, well, these are the risks that we already identified, and these are the mitigations that we have in place. This is already in place, and this is what we need to build if we want to go live with X, Y, and Z. That is very interesting. But then secondly, it's also how people are incentivized. So either people have certain KPIs, and if we set KPIs, we can kind of distill and influence behaviors. Because all of a sudden, if you get a bonus or you don't get a bonus, you're going to go for that bonus. So you're going to actually do what the KPI is there for.
In my experience, techies really clash with people whose job it is not to take risks. And I come across this all the time because as a consultant working with companies that are trying to change, there's an element of risk and innovation there that most companies are really averse to. But the engineers I've worked with in the past, well, pretty much all engineers I've worked with get really frustrated when they deal with someone who works in security or someone who works in legal who are only focused on not making a mistake.
Yeah.
And as an engineer, you're always it's quite an entrepreneurial job. Like you're always taking a risk. You're always, even when you trying to code a fix, you could spend a lot more time checking that the fix is correct, or you could just run it and see if it works, right? And that's a trade-off that you make all the time. You're always, even in that situation, you're taking a risk, and you're always making these judgments. And if your job is never to have a security breach, then you're going to say no to everything.
Yeah, that's the easiest way.
It's the easiest way.
Yeah.
And so, like you say, once you understand their motivation, where they're coming from, what their incentives are, then you can kind of deal with them in a way that they understand, which immediately puts them at their ease.
Mm-hmm.
If you're saying, I've identified all the risks for you, they go, great, you've saved me the time here.
Yeah.
Have you thought about those risks? Yeah, we've thought about this, and here's how we've mitigated, and here's what we've done. And suddenly the path becomes a lot clearer. Actually, Container Solutions is working on a project, an open source project called Continuous Compliance Framework.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And because we worked on multiple projects which in regulated industries, which involve spreadsheets and PDFs, and you write down how you're mitigating a risk and how you're the evidence you've got to conform with this thing, and every 6 months someone comes along and does an audit on you. So we had this experience over and over again. We said a lot of this can be automated. But anyway, so we produced this product that allows people to manage that. We open sourced it. We spent a lot of time working on it. And a lot of the value of that is simply that if an auditor comes along, they see that you've got your house in order. Mm-hmm. It's not that your software is necessarily more compliant than other software. It's just that you're able to expose it more easily. And I suppose that one thing I see a lot in engineers is this inability to see that because something is objectively correct, that's not enough.
Yeah.
You have to communicate that in a way that people understand, and that is a whole job in itself. And many of the techies I've worked with have got frustrated with that because they don't see, why should I have to do that if I've done it correctly?
Yeah,
it's a very common pattern I've seen. And it's something that some people never want to do, but some people can actually get a lot better at once they realize that part of the job is doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's organizations where you don't have to do that as much, where more risk is just part of the game, like a startup, for example. And I, especially early on in my career, I did not have any headspace to think about any of this. But as you get more comfortable, I feel like there's room for more learnings and more opportunities, and you get to experience and explore. I'm definitely a person that doesn't like to have this thought of oh, woe is me. If there's a legal department and they always say no, I would do my best and try kind of everything in my ability from my end to navigate that structure. Because if in the end, then my conclusion is, well, in this organization, it just really doesn't work, I at least have the feeling I tried everything. But if I haven't tried everything, I can't just make the conclusion that this is a department where no is just what is happening. And I feel like with engineers, sometimes, even with tooling, it's like, that is shit, that's always there. It's very black and white, it's very dogmatic.
Yeah, and I think what you said about startup is a really important point, because in a startup is completely different. The pressure to deliver is completely different. I mean, in the book, in Follow the Money book, I talk about patrons. And patrons, it's similar to customers. It's not the same concept. But in a startup, the patronage system is much simpler. Who is funding the business?
Yeah. Right.
That's one thing. And then who are your early customers? They're your patrons, right? And that's a relatively simple world to navigate. And what they all want is fast delivery. So that's what you give them. When you get to a large company, so I went from 39th to join in a relatively startup mode to 120,000 people at a bank.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And suddenly everything's on a different scale, and I'm dealing with a legal department who always just says no. And one of the things that happened was I ended up realizing I'm in the wrong company. It's not me, it's them. Or rather, it is me, because I like to be entrepreneurial and I like to take risks and I like to do things. I don't belong in a big organization. And one of the themes of the book is, if you're a techie and you're seeing that the technology isn't what you'd like it to be, like the architecture is wrong, whatever, you might end up realizing that the structure of the business is not going to facilitate you doing the right thing. In fact, it isn't the right thing necessarily for that business. So, realize that, understand that, and decide what you want to do about it. You can seek to change it from within, but you're probably going to have to a large extent, play within the rules of that game, or go somewhere that is more suited to your instincts.
Yeah, has different rules to the game completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's very hard to change an organization of like 120,000 people. Yeah. I do think that, especially nowadays with AI assistant development tools, the build is really accelerating the build phase of something. So we can create tools and we can create software at a speed that is unprecedented. And people have opinions on the quality, but let's just put that aside. If we build more and more and more, and we can create faster, for me, two things are going to be very interesting. Figuring out what problem we're solving, so the right problems. But then also, once you have something that you believe solves the right problem, there is still the huge challenge of distribution and adoption. Because the fact that you have one tool probably means that you've solved the problem. And if it's a really good problem, then you will have other tools that are very similar, that are trying to solve the same problem. It might be a red flag if you have the only tool that solves this problem, because then it might not actually be a problem. But let's say you found a problem you want to solve, then how do you actually get into the hands of the users and accelerate from that process, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, the cost of engineering a solution to a problem has gone down.
Yeah.
I often think of, is it Jevons paradox?
I wouldn't know.
I think it's I'll check later, but I think it's, this story where in the UK, in London, they built a ring road around London that was designed to alleviate traffic.
Yeah.
And they built it, and then traffic was worse than before because you build more infrastructure and more people use it, more cars on the road. It just got worse. You just had another place. And I think the same is true in San Francisco. Is it San Francisco? California, where they've got 8-lane motorways and they just add another lane and then that lane just gets
also
filled.
full. Yeah.
Yeah. So the paradox is you think it's going to alleviate. The demand actually goes up when you create more capacity. We now have a greater capacity to write software, so more software is going to be written. So there's going to be 10 solutions to every problem. So yeah, like you say, the challenge is going to be how do you differentiate yourself from the competition? And it may be that people who don't use AI produce a better architected solution which scales better, or it may be that it's all about the marketing and so on. But yeah, it's I think the economics of producing software. I mean, I remember when I started in the industry, there was not really even search engines weren't that helpful. You had to get a book. Okay. If you want to learn Python, you pretty much had to get a book. That's how you learned. And the other year, after 3.5 I think it was 3.5 came out, I used it to build a React app myself. And I'd kind of tried to read books on React and kind of it didn't stick, or I just didn't find it worked. But this project helped me learn how React worked, from day one, and it was perfect because I would ask questions like, "Oh, is this a single threaded app? Is this how does this work? Is this asynchronous?" And because I had that experience before, it made it very easy for me to learn. But you see other people use AI in a different way, and I just think about the maintenance challenges of all this stuff. There are going to be businesses which have been built on these technologies which no one knows how they work, and then they find that they've hit a limit of what can be done. It's reached a size, and so someone has to go in and unpick it. Yeah. I think that's going to be another interesting challenge.
Yeah, there was this, I think it was a few months ago, this person that vibe coded an app. It was kind of a social media thing where people uploaded pictures, and I think it was either for forming friendships or relationships in some form of way, specifically within a community. And then there was a data breach. And people were like, well, surprised, because this person was preaching to the choir about how it was vibe coded and how fast it went to market and how quickly it got users and usage. And now I don't think it exists anymore due to that breach specifically.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you're talking about a harness there. Like there's a compliance and security harness that must be around all these projects, right? And it sort of makes me think of that. There was that C++, was it a C compiler story? And people were like, wow, it's written a C compiler in Rust using just 200 hours or two.
From Anthropic?
Yeah. I don't know the details, but I read a very good piece on it, which said that the actually interesting part of that was the test harness. And it was the test harness that was really beautifully done, that allowed the AI to autonomously build the solution. And building a test harness is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe you can get an AI to help you with that. But doing that right is going to be a real skill, because you'll also have to think about security, compliance, maintainability. These are all the things that affect the cost of running that software. So
yeah, I had a certain perspective, I think, on things like security and compliance, especially within software engineering. I thought maybe that's kind of boring. And then I talked to someone in big tech that is responsible for that. He's, I think, one of the staff engineers, so he influences a lot of decision making on that. And he gave me a completely new perspective. He said that in essence, with software, it's very gray, right? You create something, new functionality, your user can have an opinion on it. It's more subjective, can be hit or miss. But he says when it comes to security and compliance, it's a lot more black and white. So either we do it and we do it the right way and we are not at risk, so the risk is mitigated, or you're at risk, which means that probably you, if you're responsible, you missed something, right? So there's way less margin for error. And then he said, for me, that's software engineering at a way higher level than when things are more gray, which I thought was interesting.
I have a different perspective, actually, which is that, so when I'll give a bit of background. So when I worked at this bank, we were looking at various tools around security. So I was the owner of the Docker product within this bank.
Cool.
Yeah, it wasn't really cool. It was it was an interesting experience, right? Because what that meant was that it was actually quite well organized. Every technology had an owner, and that person was the point person for that technology. And I was the point person for Docker, because at that time I'd written a book on Docker, and so they said, you're
the go-to.
And I was like, great. Like, and they were like, ha, 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 he's got that job now. Ha, ha, he can deal with it. And what that meant was then if anyone wanted to use Docker, they would phone you up.
Really?
Yeah. And say,
as a single person?
Yeah. They would just say, I want to use Docker. You're listed as the owner. Get me Docker.
Wow.
And I had to explain over and over and over again that, well, Docker at the time gives you root. So sorry, can't happen.
Yeah. You were the Department of No.
I was the Department of No.
No.
Yeah. So I was put in that position, right?
Yeah.
And I understood the context. So to me, it was like, I'm just being perfectly reasonable. And people were not happy with my response. So it was interesting. I was suddenly thrust from this position of like, hey, let's use Docker. Docker's great. And Docker can reduce the cost of development and do all these great things. I'd done that in my previous company. And now I was in the position of saying no. Maybe that actually contributed to the mindset I have now, which is kind of more tolerant. Because suddenly, I was having to say no, because I was like, I cannot do that. Like, even I do want to do that. I'd love to give you that. Anyway, the point of this story is that as part of that, I was heavily involved in the process of deciding which vulnerability tool to use, vulnerability scanner to use. And I remember having this kind of moment where we were looking at 3 or 4 different options, and we had all the outputs of them. And I was like, they all produced similar outputs, right? And I was like, the problem here is not that any of these tools is bad or good. The problem is that there's like volumes and volumes of output. How are we going to manage this? And this is where it became not a black and white problem, right? Because for each of these things, you had a number. You have the security risk number, right? And then you had to look at how likely is it that applications are going to expose those vulnerabilities. So, some vulnerabilities like 9, but if they're never exposed to the internet, it's no problem. Or if you're not using a particular operating system, it's no problem. So it wasn't a black and white thing.
Yeah.
Like, you had to actually think, like, what is the process for deciding which of these things we should focus on? What is the risk benefit of tackling them? So from my perspective, that's the difference to what you describe. I mean, if you have a number against a thing and you can say you've got that component in your Docker image, therefore you're exposed, go fix it. I mean, that's true. But the reality is that not everyone can go around. I mean, if everyone went around fixing all their Docker containers at the time, no one would have got anything done.
No. That's why I think the best people in the positions responsible for that also need to have a mindset that aligns with what the company is trying to achieve. So if you're building software as a service, one of your core components is still very much feature delivery and tailoring towards an end user. And if you're then responsible for data privacy and security, your margin of error is very low, to a point that at some point you cannot afford to have errors. But you still want to have the mindset of, okay, these are the things that we have to accommodate for, but we still want to deliver as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Then it becomes interesting.
You mentioned customers, and I would move that out slightly to patrons, right? Because if a regulator, for example, is a big patron, maybe the biggest. In a bank, it's the biggest patron there is. They can take away your banking license, then you don't have a business at all. So understanding your customers is very important, but also in a bank's case, like the customer is, I don't want to say less important than the regulator, but you're thinking about the regulator first. Because if a customer leaves, it's not that big a deal. And if you get to retail banking, it's the regulator, and individual customers don't matter. If you get to wealth banking, it's a bit different. And that's often actually why you see in banks, wealth banking applications are more bespoke and less kind of off-the-shelf generic tooling. They tend to have been written because someone or group of customers who are very important to them wanted something a certain way. So they want to be able to change that. And it's a very good example of how the architecture follows the money. In a retail bank, you just want off-the-shelf tools that are like volume-centric. In a bank, technology isn't often a huge differentiator. People would argue with me about that, but basically you want something that's safe and reliable and just runs. And so if you have millions of customers, you're not going to listen to your customers in the same way as you are a wealth management part of a bank.
Yeah. This thought that architecture follows money, where did it originate from? Where's the seed planted?
So the seed was planted when I did my first degree, I guess. So I studied history at university, and in the UK, the study of history is essentially a degree where you have to argue cases. In fact, law and history were one thing. And the thing about the study of history is that if you're asked, why did the Second World War happen, and if you just wrote an essay saying it happened because of Adolf Hitler, you'd get very, very low marks because you haven't considered the systemic causes. Not that individuals can't affect history, but they don't operate in a vacuum. So historians are systems thinkers from the ground up. They're thinking about economic production. They're thinking about commodities, mining, how money moves around the world, and so on. And so there's this joke that all historians are Marxists now, which doesn't mean they're left wing. It means they think of things in terms of economic forces. So economic forces shape things, and that's why things happen. And so this sort of systemic thinking I was already interested in before I went to university, but it really cemented that way of analyzing a problem. And so by the time I got to working at a bank, I was ready to understand this. So I worked on the OpenShift, the Kubernetes platform at this bank, and this was 2016. So it was the very early days. I think we went to production with version 3.2 of OpenShift. Yeah. Which is like 1.2 of Kubernetes. One of the big challenges we had, and this was kind of the first pattern that I really kind of developed, was that usage of this platform was exponentially growing, right? Every 3 months it would double. People really wanted to use it. And you'd think that if your user base doubles every 3 months, you'd get more funding but no. And, this wasn't used to people around me, but I was thinking, okay, so why are we not getting more funding? And the reason is that we were in a business unit that was a cost center. And that business unit got its funding every year, argued for it every January, and there were fights at board level, and eventually they'd get their money, and then the money was allocated to the different teams within there, and we were just one team within that. And if we did super well and got doubled our user base, there was no metric to to allocate funds to us.
But then what's the incentive? Why do people do their best?
Because we're morally superior.
Okay, that's fine. That's good. But like to double, yeah.
Yeah. Why did we make the effort to do that?
Yeah.
Well, from my perspective, it was the guy who hired me. He was really motivated to solve this problem. He loved building teams to solve problems like this, and he worked at this business for 30 years. He's actually a colleague of mine now. I brought him with me.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Really cool.
And he's a wonderful guy, and he did that. I think. Why did he do that? I don't know.
It could be intrinsic motivation.
I think it was just
Definitely
intrinsic
a fire
motivation
somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's what got him out of bed in the morning. Was the thought that, he could see conceptually why it worked out. Interestingly, he wasn't a sort of coder by background. He'd worked in IT for a long time, but he loved working with techies and he loved enabling them. And he was a great sort of leader of that group because he navigated a lot of the, and he still does this now. He navigated the governance and the regulatory side for us. And he actually got it done. Like it wasn't the techies that really got it done. It was kind of him who really spearheaded it. But yeah, I mean, now I would say his interests, his motivation was misaligned with the organization. And one of the things we tried to do was to see if we could get a way of moving the funds from the other business units who were consuming this central platform to fund us, so that every team who uses it pays for the center. We didn't get anywhere. And I wasn't in the thick of that, but I understood that it's very hard to get, in an organization like that, get to the people who make those decisions and get them to change the way the finance works. I mean,
it's very hard.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's very hard. It's like, this is the way we work. Like, we're not going to change it. But that was my first kind of like, oh, right, we're doing the right thing technically. We're doing the right thing. Like, I think we're doing the right things and we're obviously successful, but And the pressure from the other business units was enormous. And we used to say to them, okay, do you want to give us 2 of your staff to help deliver
that's what we
that?
need.
Yeah. And they were like, no. Why should we do that?
This is our budget.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was the first time I really sort of saw it. And then I looked back at my previous job. So I worked for that online gambling company. We had what I like to call the exact wrong number of customers to build the right software. So we had like 30 customers, of which 6 were really big. So 6 was like 80% of our income.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they were obviously in competition with each other. We were the only back-end game in town. And they were really in competition with each other. So the leadership of this 6 companies said, said to our management, we want a product. We want basically like, we don't want to spend all this money doing upgrades. We just want a product. We pay for it every year and it's predictable and so on. And our management said, okay, great, we'll go build products. And we went to build those products. And then the businesses we worked with on the ground, they didn't want that because they were in competition with each other and they wanted their thing in production so they'd get their bonus or whatever it is that they got. And they just weren't interested in the challenges of product to delivery. They just wanted their thing. So you ended up with 6 different code bases.
Oh, wow.
That were broad. Well, I mean, they weren't actually. There were 6 different implementations.
Yeah.
So there was shared code. There was code that was specific to the client, and then the database schemas were roughly similar, but not exactly the same. And of course, this meant that if you wanted what the other customer had, there was an integration cost.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And why is that? Because the patrons of the business, the big payers, they wanted things quickly. They didn't care about, I mean, online gambling was a very unregulated industry at the time. And it was a very risk-taking business because if the World Cup is coming up and you have a promotion in your retail stores for the World Cup and it's tied with what's going online and you're a week away from the World Cup and the software isn't ready, you just get it out there. And I literally was sat in meetings where people would say, oh, it's fine, we'll put it in production and then we'll let support deal with it afterwards.
Of course.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was in support. So I moved to support. It was really well paid. I had kids and it was regular hours.
Yeah.
and there was overtime. So I was like, I'll go to support.
No on-call?
It was on call. Yeah. And I really enjoyed it, actually. For a pure techie, it's great because you just see the problems. Someone brings you a problem and you're like, how are we going to solve this? I loved it. I absolutely loved that work. But it was quite stressful. It was very stressful.
Oh, yeah. I can relate. I started in operations, my career completely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a great apprenticeship because you're at the sharp end. You're seeing how things actually get done and the compromises that get made. Probably helped you in the product.
It definitely did. Yeah. Not just product, but also just the engineering part of what we need to accommodate for operationally. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, So, I mean, I loved that job for lots of reasons, but one of them was the way it changed. Like you asked me about contrarian viewpoints, right? One of them was people used to say, "Oh, the engineers should write the documentation for support," and I was like, "No,
that makes no sense.
No, support should write the documentation."
Of
and
course.
so I'd sit with these really smart people, and they would say, "Oh yeah, the really interesting thing about this project is this engine I wrote." I was like, "I'm pretty sure that works." And even if it doesn't work, I'm not going to be able to fix it.
No.
But I know that split brain problem is a thing. And they were like, oh, that shouldn't happen.
Of course.
And what happens? Like 2 months later, we have a split brain problem.
Oh, yeah.
And so we were like, no, we will write the software. You will explain to us what the software does and we will write our own documentation. You will check that documentation and then we will use that documentation for support. We called it support then. They call it SRE now. I mean,
it's evolved.
It's evolved.
Yeah.
But we were former tech leads and very senior engineers who moved to support because it was a fun place to work, believe it or not. We were empowered, so I could fix stuff in production without telling anyone.
Yeah.
And then I would go check it into the source later. So it was a very responsible job with a lot of freedom, but you had the challenge of these, very demanding customers because if the site was down, they were losing money per second. So there was a lot of pressure to get it back up.
In the teams that were developing the software for the patrons that you mentioned 30 customers, 6 of which brought in 80% of the revenue. How many people actually were aware of these revenue streams and the impact that it had on then the decision-making that was being done? Or how many people were just there and they got requirements and they executed?
I wouldn't want to answer this for them, but my impression was that people weren't thinking in that systemic way, and people generally don't. They think it's because of the people around them being stupid, basically.
Which is a common pattern, actually, that I've seen. Yeah.
And one of the nice things about this sort of these ideas I've written about and developed is that it helps you understand it's not about individuals doing stupid stuff or being stupid necessarily. It's the system, like don't hate the player, hate the game kind of thing. So I don't know how aware they were of it, but I remember I started to say, like, we have the wrong number of customers, and people would kind of laugh and go, yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I guess the problem with that thinking, though, is that it can make you quite defeatist.
I agree. And I really don't like that.
Yeah.
There was this quote that Gregor Hope shared. He shares it in his trainings, and he says, if decisions from the top don't make sense, they know something you don't. So rather than they're idiots, they're highly competent people. They got into a position for a reason. It is very unlikely that they just throw a dart on a dot bird and wherever it lands, that's the impact on you. So try and make it explicit, right? They know something you don't, so figure out what that is.
There's a story I like to tell, which is kind of an amalgam of a lot of these stories. But there was a database table we once worked on that had a column. And this column was used in a really crazy way. Like, it was, in this context, the column name was completely unrelated to how it was used. It was overloaded, so depending on the context, it would have a different meaning. It was a single character column, but it had a different meaning depending on the context. And we had all sorts of support calls about this because engineers missed this nuance, and it just looked like a really dumb decision. And it turns out that the origin story of this horrible mistake, which looks like someone was being a complete idiot, it was a week before a key accounting date, and something had to go to production. And if in this context, putting something in production was much easier if you changed the application code than if you changed the database. Database schema changes required, and an outage. And so for very good business reasons, they made that decision at the time. Now, you can argue about whether that was the right decision in the long run, whether it cost money, blah, blah, blah. But it was rational actors making a judgment call at the time. And they probably figured, oh, someone will fix it later, which, how many times have we heard that?
I think you should have an opinion on they will fix it later. But the fact that they made that decision with that context, that's fair game.
Yeah, I mean, and this pattern happens all the time. And it's so easy to say, oh, I wouldn't start from here, or, this architecture is wrong and we should correct it. It's like, well, okay, how are we going to do that?
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for all that? So yeah, but you're right. Like understanding why the system is working against your instincts can make you defeatist. I think I want people to be motivated to try and change things, but I want them to understand that it might be that the system is rigged against them.
Yeah.
And not to punish themselves too hard for that. I had one job once where I worked there for a year and the project was a complete disaster. And I remember really, really fighting it. And eventually I woke up one day and thought, actually, why am I trying so hard? Why am I killing myself doing this? I'll just stop. And I did. And like 3 months later, the project was canned. But for those 3 months, I kind of had fun because I attached myself to someone who still believed in it.
Yeah.
And said, how can I help you? And he was a great techie, and he had me working on all these things. That's where I learned Flux, and I just got back to the desk and just started coding. And I was like, this is going nowhere, but at least I'm learning something. And so that understanding helped me to kind of not kill myself doing that. So I think it's striking that balance.
I've received a question along the lines of system thinking earlier as well. And I'm not sure how I would explain to people how to start thinking in systems. I'm curious how you would describe it, since it kind of feels, from your perspective, you had it in education.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I read the book, the Donna Meadows Thinking in Systems, and it starts with the bathtub and goes from there. But I don't think it actually developed my thinking. I guess, I don't know. How do you start? I guess it's practice. Like you start looking at problems, and rather than thinking, I guess you start taking the individual out of it, especially in human challenges. I mean, bathtubs are one thing, but most of the things engineers are dealing with are human organizations. And if you start thinking empathetically, like, why is this security engineer saying no to me all the time? It's psychologically easier to think they're just an idiot. They don't like me.
It's an easy out.
It's an easy out for you. But if you dig into it, then you can understand it better. But I don't really have a better answer than that.
I do feel like solving problems and figuring out where I'm battling systems versus what is then causing an issue, I think that really helped. But you and I both worked in operations. The default example that I have in mind stems from my experience in operations, where my colleagues were doing the same thing over and over again. And I just started and I was like, there's no way in hell I'm going to be doing this thing for the rest of my life. That was my thought early in career.
Yeah.
And then I talked to some people. It was a change needed in the database. And then those symptoms never happened again.
Yeah.
And that for me was the most concrete example that I could think of. But it has a lot to do with, first of all, patience. But second of all, also a little bit of curiosity. Why are things happening the way they are? And like you mentioned, empathy plays a part in that when we're talking about other people also acting in a certain way. But I find this question quite particularly hard.
Yeah. So, I mean, that whole thing of why do some people solve the root cause, find the way to solve the root cause, and why do some just happily?
Yeah.
I mean, some people, it made me think, actually, I got into Erlang quite heavily when I was working at that gambling company, because it was a really good fit for some problems we solved. And I spent months teaching myself Erlang.
Okay.
I built like a little poker server in it. And
fun.
Yeah, it was great. And we started writing a tool for real-time updates of price changes. And Erlang's a perfect fit for that. So we built that, and we said, like, we should be doing this we should roll this out across the company. And people in senior position were like, I'm not sure about this. And I just thought, they just don't get it.
They don't get it.
Erlang is the way. And they said, okay, we'll try it with an engineer on a project. And they picked a kind of typical engineer. And he really struggled with it. And like, he was motivated and he wasn't stupid at all, but he was very competent, but he just wasn't into it. And
then it's a hard sell.
He wasn't into it. And it was like, well, that's the litmus test. You have have 700 engineers working for this company. They're not going to all learn Erlang.
No.
So either this is like an elite thing that only 3 or 4 engineers are going to do, and that's one option. But I didn't really think about that. It was only afterwards I realized, it did fail, and that's why it failed. And actually, it wasn't about the technology; it was about the adoption.
Yeah.
We had a similar challenge. The reason I got into Docker was because we didn't have any test environments, and we didn't have any CI, which sounds shocking now, but we just didn't. I know it's different now, but Docker allowed me to put together all these scripts and just shove it into a single container, and then do a daily build of each customer's environment.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it was brilliant. And I remember getting up at a conference and saying, people were saying like, why don't you just use Chef? And I was like, we have 600 engineers, teaching them all Chef is a big deal. And then the guy got up after me and was like, I don't get why teaching 600 people Chef is a
skill issue.
Yeah. It was like a skill issue.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, yeah, fine. But actually that talk where the guy kind of put me down, that talk is where I got the job at the bank, because the guy at the bank said, this guy understands.
Knows what he's doing.
Well, this guy understands that it's not just about the tech, it's about all these other things, but he can do the tech too. So let's go talk to him.
Yeah, incredibly important. I love that in the moment you have these points, and I also have these where you might not understand where certain decisions are being made, but I feel like as you get more experience, you appreciate those moments because they taught you something that you didn't realize at the time, but now reflecting, you actually understand them better.
Yeah.
It shows a lot of growth, I think.
Yeah.
And I wish that upon a lot of people. I feel like if you experience a lot of things and you have a way that is like reflecting, for me, it's a lot of these dialogues, to be honest, because I love picking people's brains. I love reflecting based on what someone says, also on my own experiences. And I'm having a lot of fun doing so. But through that, I learn a lot about my own journey in that way. And I hope people have environments and also people where they can do the same.
Yeah.
And kind of brainstorm in that way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges I got now, so as I mentioned, I'm CTO of this consultancy, is I can see across my organization, we've got these engineers who are having these amazing experiences, like really interesting experiences. But at the same time, they're under pressure because when you're on a client, the client kind of consumes you. You're really just thinking about the client.
Yeah.
But I want our engineers to learn from each other. And I've struggled with this so much. Like, how can I get this cross-pollination and this this experience to cross over? And the best way I've found actually is having a Friday lunchtime. Let's just have a chat about what's going on.
Put them together.
Yeah, and I'd say like you're not allowed to prepare if you're going to talk on something. Well, no, you don't have to prepare. Like if you come unprepared, that's totally fine.
Yeah,
and that allows the people who are focused on the client to just turn up and just start talking. And we fill the hour every time. I always think like we haven't got enough to fill this hour, but people then start talking about this, then the other. There's a lot of discussion of AI at the moment.
Of course.
We also have non-technical people coming along, and we're having to explain to them how AI works, and they're super interested, and we're trying to communicate with them. And I think just that whole that forum, it's just a little bit like what you're talking about, I think is a wonderful way of improving the experience and value of our engineers. Because one of the things I love about consulting is you're meeting all these different clients with different content. You can learn so much faster.
Yeah. I feel like finding people around you that are very enthusiastic, that have this passion, and that are also open and have the patience and willingness to share. That's the best environment to be in. Those are the environments you want to seek or cultivate.
I take hiring you have to take hiring very seriously if you're running a consultancy. And I always tell the people when we're hiring them, like, what are we looking for? We're looking for curiosity, a certain level of technical capability, and adaptability, and ability to communicate. Those are the things we're really looking for. And the technical capability is a kind of non-negotiable.
Yeah. That's what gets you in the door.
That's what gets you in the door. But do you need to know everything about everything? No. You just, if you're curious and you're motivated and you can communicate well, you can go very far as a consultant.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, and so it comes through in these sessions we have, because everyone is like super interested in sharing their knowledge and experience and learning from each other.
That's really cool. Yeah. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, it was really fun figuring out what makes seniors go beyond that ceiling, I would say, and then also picking your brain about certain systems and systemic thinking. That was a blast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Cool, we'll round it off here. If you're still with us, let me know in the comment section what you thought of this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.